Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this plastic 28mm or 1/56 scale Panzer III made by Italeri. As you can probably see, there is a Warlord logo on the box too. This model is the same as Warlord's plastic Panzer III. Down the side of the box we can see images depicting the 6 variants of Panzer III this kit can be used to make. That's Panzer III Ausf J in both early and late versions, Ausf L, Ausf M with the Scherzen, Ausf L-N with its stubby little gun, and Ausf M-N with both the Scherzen and the stubby little gun. I'm not an expert and I couldn't tell you how exact the representation of each different variant is, but they are there. I do already have a Panzer III from Rubicon and we will compare it with this Italeri model at the end of the video. Looking at the back of the box we can see a colour illustration of 4 of the 6 variants in different paint schemes representative of different theatres of war and years. There is also a photo of a built and painted example of this model. It looks to me like the L variant. There's also some suggested Italeri paint colours. This is another of these Italeri branded Warlord kits that doesn't come with paint or glue. It seems to be kind of random which of their kits come with those extras. It's not really a big deal to me. Let's have a look at what's in the box, starting with this instruction sheet. The first page has an image of the sprues. You could use this to check if any of the parts are missing. The reason I call this an instruction sheet rather than a leaflet is because there are a lot of instructions in here and it folds out to be quite large. You could almost use it as a very thin and uncomfortable bed sheet. I find instructions like this to be awkward and annoying, though I have seen larger instruction sheets, and it does seem as though Italeri has made an effort to condense these instructions at least a little bit. That does potentially lead to its own problems though. For the most part, the instructions are clear and easy to follow, though I can see a few places where it might become a little bit confusing. Like this step for gun assembly. I do understand that it's to save space, but they could have separate diagrams for different variants of assemblies rather than cramming them all into one diagram. I can imagine it was a bit of a challenge for whoever designed the instructions. They're not awful, they just have potential for confusion. The takeaway from this is that you should pay closer attention to the instructions as you are building. We also get this set of decals. Nothing too exciting here, but they do look like they'll be effective for adding numbers to the tank. And last, but certainly not least, there are 2 sprues that come wrapped in a protective bag. The first sprue contains things like the hull, spare wheels and tracks, shirts and mounts, gun mantlets, and a commander. The parts look to be fairly neatly moulded, though there are a few relatively large mould lines and bits of flashing here and there. Nothing too bad though, and it's all pretty easy to clean up quickly. The commander figure looks to be the same as the commander in all the other Italeri plastic German vehicles that I've built so far. He looks okay to me, but I have seen people complaining about the scale of the figures in these kits. It's not something that bothers me too much and I don't usually use them anyway. The second sprue mostly contains wheel sets and tracks, though there are also a couple of other Panzer bits like most of the turret. I don't really have a whole lot to say about this sprue. It's much like the first in terms of quality. The tracks are really quite nicely detailed, and like the Italeri Warlord plastic Tiger I built recently, they come in 4 pieces. Because of my experience with that build, I do expect these tracks to be at least similar and end up looking pretty good. This sprue also has the Scherzen for the hull. I do kind of want to include that in my build, but I would really prefer to build a J variant and it doesn't have Scherzen. If I ever build another one of these, it will be a variant that does have Scherzen. So with that out of the way, let's get to building the Panzer III Ausf J. I'm going to be a good boy and do as the instructions say and begin assembly with the track sets using all these parts. On the left you can see a small hatch. This part is only needed for the versions of the tank without Scherzen. It won't be visible on the tanks that do have it. To install this, we're going to need to do some drilling. The bit I have in my pin vise is a bit smaller than the holes we need to make, but that's okay. I'm going to use my knife to gently expand those holes to where we need them. You could of course use a bigger drill bit, but I'm too lazy to try and find one. Then the hatch part can be glued into place. The angled part of the hatch should be on the bottom rear-facing edge. The holes I made ended up being a little bit too big, but that's okay in this case because the part itself hides the evidence, though it does introduce more of a chance for the part to be mounted lopsided, so make sure it's on nice and straight. This should of course be repeated for the other track set too. Next, I glue on the drive sprocket. You may be able to see that the guide pins and corresponding holes are slightly different sizes. This will make it hard to put the drive sprocket on the wrong way, though it should be fairly obvious which way the part goes anyway. I then glue the track parts on. I suggest clipping the correct parts for each side off the sprue separately so you don't accidentally put the track parts on the wrong side. Attaching these should be simple, and for the upper section of track it was. The part is shaped such that it will sit neatly on top of the sprocket and return rollers. The front and rear end parts are also quite easy to attach. There's a kind of keying on the back of these parts, and while it does help you figure out which part goes on the front and rear, I found it to be a bit of a hindrance to getting the parts on straight. Though it's not a huge issue. The lower section of track, however, is a bit of a problem. As you can see, the guide horns are supposed to be cut down to allow the road wheels to sit against the tracks. Unfortunately, they're not cut all the way down. I don't know if this is an error in the molding process or just bad design, but it sure is annoying. It looks as though the road wheels are hovering above the tracks, and I don't think anybody wants that. I used my knife to trim down the offending guide horns. Obviously, I'm cutting towards myself like a numpty. You should probably not do that. You could cut yourself and bleed to death. This trimming is easy enough, but if you look closely at these tracks, they won't look nearly as good as if the parts were molded properly. The problem isn't that it's hard to do, it's that it shouldn't be necessary in the first place. Once I finished all that trimming, the parts still did not fit. This was obviously annoying. To rectify this situation, I clipped a single track link from the rear end of the run. I test fit it and it finally fit a little better, so I glued it into place. It's definitely not perfect, but they do look fairly good. I had been expecting good things from these tracks after building the similar tracks on Italeri's Tiger a few weeks ago, but these were quite annoying and a bit of effort to put together. After all that work, the tracks are now ready to be attached to the hull, but first we need to make some small modifications to the hull part. Because I'm building the J variant, we need to open up a couple of holes in the rear of the hull. I do like this idea for parts that are optional. I think it's better to drill holes out rather than having to fill them if you aren't adding certain parts. These are a little bit annoying though, because the mounting pins for these optional parts and thus their mounting holes are rectangular. It is much easier to just drill a round hole and be done with it. I drilled a small pilot hole and then used my knife to kajigger the small hole into a bigger, more rectangular one. If you have small square files, this would be a good place to use them. This was a little bit annoying. They could have put a bit more thought into this and made the guide pins rounded to simplify assembly, like they did with the hatches on the sides of the track sets. Speaking of track sets, I decided to attach these now because they will help inform the positioning of the spare track links on the front of the hull. The tracks are very easy to attach to the side of the hull. Not really a lot to say about that. I then add the spare track links to the lower front plate. Because it was annoying to make a rectangular hole in the rear of the hull, I figured I would just glue the spare track links to the front of the hull with no mounting pins. This meant I had to slice the mounting pins off the back of the track link part. You'll notice this time I'm cutting away from myself. Safety first. Sometimes. I glue the part to the front of the hull using the picture on the front of the box as a reference for positioning. I don't think it's super important to get this perfect, but the bar that holds the tracks in place should at least be facing towards the bottom of the model. Now it is time to add the details to the rear of the hull. Because I'm building the J variant, I want to use the diagram on the upper left. I'll use all of these parts to make a nice Panzer III butt. I start by gluing the exhaust and mufflers part to the curved plate thing. I'm not sure, but I think that plate is for deflecting air and exhaust away from the vehicle. After gluing the two parts together, I attached them to the hull using the mounting holes I cut out earlier. I then went to attach these lift or towing points or whatever they are, and I realized I had kind of made a mistake. I really should have glued these on before the exhaust assembly, but hey, maybe you can learn from my mistake. I did get the parts into place, but it was fiddly and annoying. Next, I add this little dome thing to the bottom of the rear hull. This is another part whose function I'm not sure of, but it goes here. I used my knife to jimmy it into position. The upper rear platey part thing can then be glued into place here. No trouble attaching this. Now we can move on to the upper hull. In order to build the J variant, more holes need to be drilled into this to add more details. Holes for the shirts and supports would also be drilled at this point if it was being added, but it's not, so we just need a hole here, here, and here in the center of these three holes. These need to be rectangular like the ones on the rear hull, so I jimmy them with my knife, being careful not to make them too big. The instructions also say to cut out a slot for the spare tracks on the upper frontal hull if you're going to be adding them. I'm just going to attach these the same way as the tracks on the lower hull because it's easier. Next, I attach this thing to the right rear of the hull using the holes we made earlier. I believe this is for holding the antenna when it's not in the raised position. The part sort of slopes downwards towards the rear of the tank. Then I add this piece, which I'm pretty sure is the base for the antenna. I'm not sure if this should be connected to the antenna holder or what. I've placed it right where it looks like the instructions are saying it should go. It really would be nice if there was something to guide this part, but there isn't. Next comes the fire extinguisher. It seems the J variant has the fire extinguisher mounted parallel with the hull. On other variants it's angled, as shown in the diagram. I was confused by this for a short while, but it's no big deal and the part is easily glued into place. Right in front of the fire extinguisher is where the jack is glued in. Not a whole lot to say here. The part does have a weird little blemish on it, but it's not too bad. Next, I glue the sets of spare wheels together. These have a guide pin and a hole to ensure they go together properly, and there are 2 sets consisting of 2 wheels. It makes sense to then glue these sets of wheels to the hull. Very easy to install, and in my opinion, they look pretty good. Continuing with the details, I add a pair of headlamps. For this, I applied the glue from the inside to avoid making too much mess. I should probably do this more often. The headlamps go into the holes in the front plate like so, with the flatter part facing forwards. They're a little bit fiddly, but not too hard to get straight enough. They're not perfect, but close enough for me. I then add this covered lamp. Not sure what it's called. Blackout light? Whatever it is, it goes here and it's pretty easy to attach and line up. Next, I attach the upper frontal plate. There is another up-armoured plate that goes over the top of this one, but that isn't used on the J variant. I had to press this part onto the hull to minimise the gap there. While we're here, I might as well install the hull machine gun. It fits into the hole easily enough, though I did have to apply a little bit of pressure to get it to go all the way into its hole. Be careful not to break the part, or your Panzer won't be able to spray bullets at the enemy as effectively, and that would be unfortunate. The instructions don't say to join the 2 halves of the hull yet, but I'm going to do it anyway, mostly because there isn't anything further to do with the hull for the J variant. There is a kind of pin and receptacle at the rear of the tank to ensure the parts go together properly. I had to hold the pieces together at the front of the hull to minimise gaps, but other than that, this was quick and easy. The hull is now complete, and it is time to move on to the turret. I started with the main gun assembly using all these parts. First, I put the rearmost mantlet part through the turret front part like so. The wider part of the turret goes towards the bottom and the MG port on the mantlet goes on the right. This can be built in such a way that the gun can elevate and depress, but as usual I don't really want that feature, so I glued it together like so and then added the back part. I guess the back part isn't really necessary if you're gluing the entire assembly in place, but I add it anyway just for a little bit more strength. I then glue on the outer gun mantlet, obviously making sure the opening for the machine gun is on the correct side. I then glue on the end part of this wide part at the end of the gun. I don't know what this thing is called. I guess it holds the gun recuperating things or something like that. Anyway, the end part that also holds the gun can then be glued on very easily. I then install the coaxial machine gun, making sure it's straight and aligned with the main gun. And then I put this assembly aside while I build the rest of the turret. We'll look at the gun itself later. I start building the turret by gluing in the turret floor, which is hard to get wrong. Just make sure the floor part is pushed all the way towards the rear of the turret. I then attach the turret rear and both sides. All of these are really easy to get into position. I like the railing things along the top of the turret sides, though they did have quite a bit of flash and needed a lot of cleanup. It was at this point that I realised I had skipped a step. I should have drilled a hole into the turret sides to attach some vision ports, but I guess I will deal with that when I get to it. I had skipped that because I assumed all those holes were to be drilled for shirts and supports. Should have paid closer attention to the instructions. Next, I glue the turret front and mantlet assembly to the front of the turret. Crazy, I know, but come with me on this adventure. The part does fit quite nicely, though there isn't really anything except the shape of the turret to guide positioning, and so it would be pretty easy to get this misaligned. I then glue on the turret side doors. These parts are keyed to make positioning easy, but there is still a bit of play in the parts, so make sure it's on straight. Next come these vision devices, or at least I'm assuming that's what they are. These are only used on the J variant, which is a good reason for there being no holes for mounting them on the turret sides. Like I did with the spare track links, I just chopped the part's guide pin off, again cutting away from myself. I then glue the part onto the side of the turret. I sort of just guessed at the correct positioning of these using pictures as references. It's almost certainly not perfect, but I think it's close enough. Some poor rivet counter probably just fell out of his chair. Next comes this thing. I don't really know what this tiny part is. My guess is it's a kind of stopper for the turret doors, or maybe antenna mounts. I don't know, but it goes on here. The other side of the turret has the same details. Well, not the same, they're different parts specifically for that side, but you know what I meant. Attaching the commander's cupola is the next step. The cupola comes in 2 pieces, both of which have keying to ensure they are correctly attached to each other and the turret roof. I think it looks reasonable, though I have always thought these cupolas look kind of weird. Next, I made another mistake. Here you can see I've put the glue in the wrong spot. I had assumed the hatch would just sit on top of where I put the glue. I wiped it away as best I could with my finger. I didn't try scraping it out because that would cause more damage to the plastic than just having the glue sitting there. My second attempt was much more successful. This is a great example of what happens when you don't test fit things properly. I should be able to get away with this when the model is painted. The excess glue should either be invisible or it could be painted up as built up dirt and grime. Next, I give the stowage bin its lid. This time I put the glue in the right place. I then attach it to the turret rear. There is a raised guide part on the turret ensuring the stowage bin can't be put on incorrectly. The turret's looking good, it just needs one more thing. The gun. Because I'm building the late version of the Panzer IIIJ, I'm going to be using the longer 50mm gun. This only needed a tiny bit of cleanup before being installed. I quite like that the end of the barrel is already bored out. It looks much neater than if I'd had to drill it out myself. The gun is very easily glued into place. Just make sure it's nice and straight, and that's about all you have to do. That's one 28mm scale plastic Panzer IIIJ by Italeri completed. Let's now compare it with Rubicon's Panzer III. Though in fairness, it is a different variant of the Panzer III, so it is going to look a bit different. If you want to see the build video of the Rubicon Panzer III I did a while ago, you can click the video on screen now. Unsurprisingly, both models look the way a Panzer III should. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on tanks or scale or anything like that, but one thing I can say for sure is that Rubicon's offering has much better looking road wheels. They look like separate pieces, unlike Italeri's road wheels, which you can see join right onto the side of the hull. To me, this isn't as big a problem as with the previous Italeri vehicles I built which had interleaved road wheels. And if you build a version with the shirts and you won't even see the back of the wheels anyway. It still looks kind of bad to me though. Italeri's spare road wheels, jack and fire extinguisher look better because they're all separate pieces. Rubicon's track sets were much easier to build owing to them being mostly single piece, and I didn't need to cut off bits of track detail to get them to go together. I like that Italeri's model has the hatches in the side of the hull. Rubicon's version lacks these. Much like the regular tracks, the spare track links on the Italeri model are better looking, and I like its headlamps better too. The Rubicon model is an up-armoured version, so it's not quite a direct comparison. You can see they're definitely not identical, but a lot of the same details are present on both models. On the rear, the main differences I can see are that these tanks have different exhaust systems, and the Italeri Panzer has the more detailed tracks. The cables on the engine deck of both models look a little bit soft and almost like they're melting into the hull, though I'm sure a little bit of paint will fix that. I think both models are fairly good representations of a Panzer III, and they look to be very close to each other in terms of dimensions. Both of them look good to me, just different, and they both have a place in my mighty German army, though they'll probably both be painted differently just because. I do quite like this model. The kit was, for the most part, easy and relatively quick to build. There were no parts missing from the sprues, and something I really like is that there were quite a few bits left over for my bits box to feast upon. I like that there are so many options for different variants of the Panzer III you can build with this kit. The instructions were easy enough to understand, though as I mentioned earlier, there is definitely potential for confusion in some places. I should have paid better attention to those instructions, but even though I did make a couple of mistakes, it worked out okay in the end. The tracks were a bit miserable to put together. I was disappointed they didn't go together quite as well as Italeri's Tiger, and while they were annoying and more work to put in than they should have been, they turned out looking alright, especially from a distance. The details on the tracks themselves are quite good and do help to make up for some of the poor fit. Paint and weathering should make up for the rest. I think this tank will look nice when I do eventually get around to painting it. I'm thinking about painting one of my Panzer IIIs in an Africa Corps colour scheme, but I'm not sure which one. I don't know if either of the variants of Panzer III that I have ever fought in the desert, but to be honest, that doesn't really bother me a whole lot. I'm not a rivet counter by any stretch of the imagination. Or is it a paint counter if it's talking about paint? I don't know. Let's just go with rivet counter. I'm not one. Anyway, what do you guys think? If you've got any suggestions for a paint scheme, leave them in the comments section below. And if you have any other comments, questions or suggestions, I would like to see those too. Hopefully this video has been interesting or helpful for you. If you liked it, go ahead and click the thumbs up button. Obviously the thumbs down button if you didn't like it. If you want to be awesome and helpful, you can share the video with anyone you can think of that might find it useful or interesting. And of course, subscribe if you haven't already. It is well known that subscribers to my channel are more attractive to the opposite sex. If you really like the videos I make, please consider helping to support the channel via Patreon. Patrons get to see my videos a little bit early and take part in polls and such. If that interests you, head over to patreon.com/Erpaderp. You can get there by clicking the Patreon logo on screen or the link in the description. Or the olden days method of typing the address into the address bar, I guess. Anyway, I'll be back again soon, so until then, happy modelling and thanks for watching. Farewell.